Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to invite you now to move out of your Lutheran context and Danish context and think a little globally for the next session. And hopefully you will find what I say is relevant to your context. Let me begin though with a famous Lutheran theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a very famous quotation from him while he was in prison. He wrote, "We have for once learned to see the great events of history from the underside, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, the reviled. In short, from the perspective of those who suffer." I was in Bangalore in India one freezing winter, maybe not freezing by Danish standards, but certainly by South Indian standards. And I was watching construction workers as they erected an office tower that was going to house one of the famous companies in the global computer industry. The workers were inadequately clothed. Their accommodation took the form of flimsy canvas tents. And I found myself wondering, what will this computer company do for these workers, most of whom were being drawn as casual labor from surrounding villages? Will they slap copyright laws on their software products so that the children of these workers, even if they are fortunate enough to go to school, can never afford them? And what does the concept of intellectual property rights mean when it is the general public, both in the rich world and the poor world, whose taxes often subsidize these companies, their research as well as their global operations? The Western media is enamored with the so-called New India of glamour and wealth. And local Indian media follow suit. There are television channels in India which report around the clock on how the Mumbai Stock Exchange is doing, despite the fact that less than 3% of Indians own stocks. And the media largely fail to report stories of the brutal suppression of peaceful protests by India's poor in the capital Delhi, or the forcible annexation of rural lands by wealthy companies. 2 million children under the age of 5 die every year in India. That is one child every 15 seconds. And the media don't report it. And what is true of India is true for every other society on earth. The media is obsessed with so-called celebrities. The education system, the advertising world, the political process, the criminal justice system, these are all biased towards the rich and the powerful. And that is why Bonhoeffer says, we have learned. It's not something that comes naturally. We have to learn another perspective, another way of looking at things, looking at the world. There are limits to empathy and to enlightened self-interest. The moral demands on us often go against our self-interest. And somewhere along the line, we have to start thinking in terms of justice. And justice rests on certain convictions, certain beliefs that we have about human beings. Justice involves our social engagements. The society is just insofar as its members enjoy the goods to which they have a right. And rights are ultimately grounded in what respect for the worth of a human person requires. Rights, in other words, are normative social relationships. The other person comes into my presence already bearing certain claims against me, and vice versa. Now, my learning, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's, occurred through prolonged immersion in the world of the biblical narrative, the scriptures of the Christian church, as well as immersion in the pain and the suffering of my society. I remember being amazed when I read the Bible for the first time as a student in high school. I discovered a strange God, a God who is so different from the God that both atheists and the religious people that I knew talked about. I discovered a God who protests against the suffering of the innocent. A God who condemns religions for the way that religions sanction and justify suffering. And a God whose deep pain over evil is expressed through the prophets and culminates in the crucifixion of Jesus. If the cross of Jesus tells us that God is found in the mess that we human beings have made of the world, then the part of God can hardly be that of a distant ruler who shows his supremacy by avoiding pain. It can only be the power of a love that works through pain and through weakness. And this again, let me remind you, is a very prominent theme in the theology of Martin Luther. Not the God of glory, but the God of weakness, the God of suffering. A God who has chosen to be vulnerable to suffering and death. And if God himself then suffers and is found in those places of human tragedy and human suffering, God too is to be numbered amongst the victims. God is not found amongst the torturers and the oppressors. God is the ultimate victim of human history. And I suggest that it is that perspective that helps us to distinguish the true victims in our world from everybody else who likes to be called a victim. For the God who suffers as the victim is also the God of justice. Justice is at the heart of the biblical vision of life. For example, Isaiah 61 verse 8, I, the Lord, love justice. And this is repeated throughout the Hebrew Bible. Now, in saying that God loves justice, the biblical writers are saying that what God loves is the presence of justice in a society. And God loves the presence of justice in society simply because God desires that every single human being in that society should flourish, that each and every person should experience what the Bible calls shalom. Injustice is the breaking of shalom. And love and justice are never pitted against each other. Love and justice are inseparable. Love for the other calls forth the demand of justice for the other. The biblical narrative speaks not only of God as a God of justice, but one whose demand for justice takes a concrete shape in terms of solidarity with the widow, the orphan, the resident foreigner. The widow, the orphan, the resident foreigner, and the impoverished, these were the most vulnerable people in ancient Israelite society. They were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They were the ones who were most likely to be pushed to the wall or to be scapegoated, to be downtrodden in times of economic hardship. The rich and the powerful simply walked all over them, trampled them down. And rendering justice to people like this is often described as lifting them up. The biblical prophets and the psalmists do not give us a philosophical theory of justice that requires alleviating the plight of the widow, the orphan, the resident foreigner. The resident foreigner is what people today call refugees and asylum seekers, migrants. The biblical writers simply assume it. Whenever they speak of God's justice, whenever they urge their hearers to practice justice, whenever they complain to God about the absence of justice, they simply take it for granted that justice requires lifting up those who are at the bottom. So just some representative quotations. Isaiah 1:17, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. And addressing the wider world of nations and their rulers, the psalmist writes, give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Elsewhere, Proverbs 31, addressed to rulers, to kings. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Notice the language of rights. Long before the 18th century European enlightenments and the various modern constitutions, the ancient book of Lamentations reminds us, when all the prisoners of the land are crushed underfoot, when human rights are perverted in the presence of the Most High, when one's case is subverted, does the Lord, Yahweh, not see it? Human beings, while part and parcel of God's animal kingdom, occupy a special place amongst all God's creatures because they alone constitute what's called the image of God on earth. A stone or metal image that an ancient king set up was a physical symbol of his sovereignty over a particular territory. The stone or metal image represented the king to his subject peoples. If anyone came along and damaged an image of the king, that person was rebelling against the king's authority. But here in the Genesis narrative, it is men and women, not metal images or stone images, who represent God on the planet Earth. So it follows that the way that we treat our fellow human being is a reflection of our attitude to the Creator. To treat unjustly one of these human creatures in whom God delights is to grieve God, to bring sorrow to God. It's to wound Him whenever we wound His beloved. And this was a unique, a countercultural vision of God, a vision that was entrusted to the people of Israel for the sake of the whole world. And that is why in the biblical prophets, idolatry, the worship of God substitutes, other gods, goes hand in hand with social injustice and oppression. When we turn our backs on the God of the biblical narrative, then we also turn our back on our neighbor. Now Jesus greatly expanded the category of the downtrodden to include not just the victims of social structures and practices like widows, orphans, aliens, the poor, the imprisoned, but also those who were excluded from full participation in society because they were in some way defective, malformed physically or mentally, or seen as religiously inferior. The inbreaking of God's just reign through the Christ event requires that these people too be lifted up. Justice is essentially the healing of relationships, the overcoming of animosities, of divisions. Its goal or telos is reconciliation, the restoration of human flourishing. So let me try to translate this vision of inherent human worth and the demand for social justice into three global areas which are challenges to us today. Three great ethical challenges. The first is gross economic inequality. We are living in a world that is becoming more and more unequal unequal across nations and unequal within nations. Maybe not so much here in Denmark, but certainly if you look at the United States, if you look at Britain, if you look at India, China, Brazil, the income gap between peoples is widening to obscene proportions. For example, the income of the highest paid 1/5 of American wage earners has risen by 100% since the 1970s, but it has fallen by 10% for the rest of the population. That is 4/5 of American workers. 5% of the world owns 85% of its wealth, and less than 100 families own more than half the world's wealth. The wealth of the big banks, those that were responsible for the financial crisis in 2008, has grown enormously in the 5 or 6 years since then. 1 in 10 deposits in the US are in the hands of just one bank, JP Morgan Chase. The wealthiest family in the US, the owners of the Walmart chain, have assets which amount to $90 billion US, and that is the same as the combined income of the 40% poorest Americans, or 120 million people. Now, gross social inequality has harmful consequences in a number of areas, but the conventional economists ignore it until relatively recently. Conventional economics has focused on growth and swallowed the myth that wealth that is generated at the top will somehow automatically trickle down to the bottom through the creation of jobs and rising wages. Inequalities destroy social solidarity. They undermine democracy. Those who have more resources are able to manipulate public policy in their favor at the expense of those who have few resources. If you look at noisy or dangerous factories, where are they sited? Our toxic waste, where is toxic waste dumped? Not in affluent suburbs or in the gated condominiums of the super rich, but always in places where the least well-off people live and work. Adam Smith in the 18th century pointed out that the ability to appear in public without shame requires more in a rich society than in an overall poor one. He suggested that at a certain point a man needs a linen shirt, which was then considered a luxury, to be respectably dressed. To impress at the job interview, one needs not only the relevant skill or ability, but has to wear the right clothing, the right means of transport, perhaps the right accent, and social mannerisms. And of course, a mailing address, a fixed board is required, taken for granted. Becoming relatively worse off can actually make a person absolutely worse off in terms of opportunities and social standing. And in a materialistic, consumerist society where money is what gives human beings value and status, those who have little money internalize their feelings of inferiority, they suffer from low self-esteem, and so they are disempowered even more. And that's why being poor in Europe or the US is actually more degrading, more humiliating than being poor in Bangladesh. And I find that Christian NGOs actually totally ignore this whole dimension of economic and social inequality. They are, in a right sense, concerned with the destitute, the poorest of the poor, and often work with them. But they forget that inequality also needs to be addressed. A second challenge, the protection of very young humans. We are all human animals, and the vast majority of us, those who are not the products of what's called monozygotic twinning, that is twinning from a single fertilized egg. All of us began our lives at conception. Each of us was once an embryo, just as each of us was once an adolescent, a child, an infant, and a fetus. From a scientific point of view, there is no doubt at all concerning what the early embryo is. The early human embryo is a human being at the earliest stage of his or her development. Not a potential human being or a pre-human being or a mass of cells, but an individual member of the species Homo sapiens. As modern embryology confirms, beyond any shadow of doubt, we were never mere parts of our mothers. We were, from the beginning, self-integrating organisms that developed to maturity by a gradual, self-directed process. So the embryo is a new human being, the same self-directing human organism as a later child and adult. The changes from embryo to fetus to infant to adolescent to adult are merely changes in degree of natural development of the same individual. Now, where moral reasoning enters is in the following way. If we accept that human beings are intrinsically valuable and deserve full moral respect by virtue of what they are, as opposed to what they possess or what they achieve, does it not follow that they are intrinsically valuable from the point at which they came into being? In that case, embryo-destructive medical research for putative benefits to others, and the abortion of fetuses either for social convenience or because they are defective in some way, are these not a violation of the most fundamental human right, namely the right to life of innocent human persons? And then a third global challenge is that of global warming and climate change. This is not simply an environmental issue, it is a justice issue. Those people who suffer most from global warming are the ones who are least responsible for it. 1/6 of the world's population is so poor, they produce no significant carbon emissions at all. And yet they are unfairly being blamed because their breeding rates are higher than those of the rich. But the issue is not primarily population, but consumption. Even though the rate of population growth in Bangladesh is 50 times that of Great Britain, every new British consumer uses up to 45 times more fossil fuels than every Bangladeshi. Households in India earning less than $65 a month use 1/5 of the electricity per head and 1/7 of the transport fuel of those households in India that earn more than $65. And those who sleep on the streets use almost nothing. George Monbiot points out that an owner of a super yacht does more damage to the biosphere in 10 minutes of sailing than most Africans do in their entire lifetime. So what global warming represents is the theft of the global commons by the rich world. And by the rich world, I mean also the rich elites of countries like India, China, Brazil. The rich pollute the atmosphere and the commons. They steal from the rest of humankind their means of survival, let alone their well-being. The atmosphere and the oceans have become the medium by which wealthy corporations, governments, and individuals transfer their harmful activities to other regions and other peoples. Now, the reason I have chosen those three global challenges is that you rarely hear these three global challenges mentioned in the same Christian conference. If you go to a conference of the World Council of Churches, they will speak a lot about gross economic inequality and about global warming, but not about the vulnerability of very young humans. If you go to an evangelical Christian conference, you may hear about the vulnerability of very young humans and our need to protect them, but you will not hear much about gross economic inequality or global warming or climate change. Some closing remarks. Nicholas Walterstoff, an American philosopher, writes, "The greatest challenge facing any theory of rights is to explain the difference. Why is it that we have a right to certain actions and restraints from action on the part of persons and social entities, whereas to other actions and restraints we do not have a right, even when those others would be life goods for us, enhancing our flourishing? Why do I have a right to a polite answer from the receptionist in the clinic when I ask where I must go for my flu shot, but not a right to her giving me that fine etching or painting hanging on her wall, even though over the long run, being given the etching would enhance my flourishing much more than a gruff answer to my question diminishes it?" That's a philosophical question. Now, when it comes to that class of moral rights that we call inherent human rights, secularist thinkers are haunted by a challenge posed by Friedrich Nietzsche in the late 19th century. Nietzsche asked, in the absence of belief in God, what is it about each and every human being that makes him or her valuable? What is it that gives human beings a dignity adequate for grounding the language of human rights? Now, secularist thinkers try to ground such rights in the human capacity for moral or rational agency. Now, no doubt the capacity for such agency is a source of great worth, but that cannot adequately ground human rights. Because surely those who exercise their moral capacity or their reasoning more excellently than others are of more worth than others. Also, a good many human beings have not yet realized those capacities, like embryos, fetuses, little children. Some never will. For example, the mentally impaired, those suffering from dementia. Their dignity, their rights can never be protected within an atheist or secularist worldview. Now, Christian thought maintains that it is being loved by God despite our moral flaws, irrespective of who we are as human beings, that ultimately gives every human person great worth. Human beings are of intrinsic and equal worth because of what God thinks of them, how God relates to them. And God has not only created human beings as His image, as we saw earlier, but He has taken our humanity into His own divine life forever through an act of incarnation in Jesus Christ. So just as we value a sculpture by Michelangelo simply because it comes from the hand of the master, so when we stand before another person, however disabled, destitute, diseased, or degraded, we are standing before someone who participates in the divine, someone whose great worth has been bestowed on him or her by God. Thus that person faces us bearing legitimate claims on us, claims to behave in certain ways towards him or her, and to restrain from behaving in other ways. Now, it is this framework of moral conviction that sustains the discourse of human rights and secures justice for men, women, and children all over the world. Finally, justice in the Bible is always set within an eschatological frame. It is something that we are hoping for, something that we are seeking. Justice is never and can never be fully embodied in any legal, political, or social system. It's always elusive, it's always beyond our grasp. We remain self-centered and twisted creatures, seeking ways to evade and to corrupt the good. Any manifestation of justice here and now can only be provisional and relative when measured against the coming justice of God. The incarnation and the resurrection of Jesus Christ signifies God's intention to redeem the earth and all the earth's oppressed creatures. The resurrection is God's decisive yes to our humanity, that this embodied, interdependent humanity has a future. And we bear witness to this hope by concrete actions on behalf of those poor and voiceless human and non-human creatures whose prospects are threatened today and whose worth is grounded in the redemptive love of